Knowing the whole counsel of God requires that you know some of the key Old Testament covenants and promises. If you want to know sound doctrine, you've got to know the 4 biblical covenants and where they show up in the Old Testament. First one I want us to look at is the Abrahamic covenant and circumcision. Turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, where we read this. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." I want you to take a little note of that statement. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. A few chapters later in Genesis 15, we read that Abraham believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as a righteousness. Later on in chapter 15, the Lord makes a covenant with Abram. Then if you skip over to Genesis 17, the Lord changes Abram's name to Abraham. He says to Abraham, "So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant." We've already seen in Genesis 9 the unconditional covenant God made with Noah and his creation. Something to keep in mind is that big picture, God is a covenant-keeping God. You really cannot understand the whole counsel of God without understanding the covenants. You cannot really understand the Bible without understanding that God makes covenants with His creation and His people. Now, a covenant is a formal agreement between two parties. A covenant states the stipulations and regulations for the relationship. Most of the biblical covenants are unconditional covenants, with the exception of the Mosaic covenant. There's actually some disagreement over the total number or amounts of covenants, and it's not really our purpose to debate how many covenants there are, but for our purpose, we want to look at the clearly defined biblical covenants found in the Old Testament and New Testaments. And the first one, as I mentioned, is the Abrahamic covenant. Paul speaks of this covenant as it relates to the gospel. God reveals, really, if you think about it, a lot about Himself through these covenants. First of all, again, He's a covenant-keeping God. He's always faithful to His promises. He can be trusted fully. He's a trustworthy God. You can bank on Him. But the covenants also reveal a lot about us, especially our need for faith in the promises of God. The Abrahamic covenant begins with God's call to Abraham to leave his homeland and possess a new land and start a new nation family. We see this in Genesis 11 through 12. God takes all the initiative in this. He makes a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And the Abrahamic covenant essentially promised 4 things. First of all, a land for Abraham and his descendants. Second of all, a great number of descendants for Abraham, like the stars in heaven. He will be the father of many nations, and kings will come from him. Third was fame. Fourth is universal blessing for all nations, Jews and Gentiles. It really is fundamental that you know Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. It's foundational to the book of Genesis and really the whole Bible. It explains the Jewish people and what God expects to do through them. But especially observe verse 3 of Genesis 12. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, it's also absolutely essential you know Genesis chapter 15. You need to know this chapter well. And of particular importance is verses 4 through 6. Notice how Abraham is declared righteous by faith in the promises of God. This story will be repeated in the New Testament as it relates to the gospel. Then see how God obligates Himself to fulfill the covenant with Abraham and his offspring. See verses 7 through 17 and carefully observe how He walks through the bloody animal pieces to ratify the covenant. This is how covenants were ratified in the ancient Near East. Look at chapter 15, verse 18. We read this. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Over in Genesis 17, we see the sign of circumcision given by God as a physical sign or rite of the covenant people of God, the son of Abraham, the people of the land. All the sons of Abraham were obligated to be circumcised in order to participate in the covenant blessings. Finally, we see Abraham tested with the offering of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. Abraham is obedient to God and the father of all who believe the word of the Lord. The second covenant I want us to look at is the Mosaic covenant, where the law of Moses is given. To know the whole counsel of God, you've got to know the Mosaic covenant. It is the law of God given to the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. The rest of the story of the Old Testament revolves around really the Mosaic covenant. In Exodus 19, verses 5 through 6, we read really a significant aspect in the biblical storyline. It says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." God speaks to the nation through Moses. The people say, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And God meets the people and speaks directly to them in an audible voice, and He gives them the law. In Exodus 20, we read the 10 Commandments in chapter 20. The Lord gives the law. It's a terrifying experience, actually. If you look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 18 through 21, we read this. "Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, 'You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die.' Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of Him may be before you, that you may not sin.' The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was." You should go back and carefully read all of Exodus 20. It's a wonderful chapter where the 10 Commandments are given. And these 10 Commandments are followed by further commandments. These are important chapters. It's also important you know Exodus 24, 1 through 18, but especially observe verses 6 through 8, the time at which the Mosaic covenant was ratified by the blood of animals. Now, talk about this chapter with your mentor. It's a significant chapter in the Bible. This passage is really fundamental to your understanding of the entire storyline of the Bible. You need to know these events in the history of redemption. Now, the Mosaic law was meant to govern every aspect of the lives of the children of Israel, the personal, social, civil aspects, their worship. The law consisted of a total of 613 commandments, and of course the famous 10 Commandments, which is really a summary of what God requires of His people Israel. The law gave specific details of how to approach God, how to worship God. It gave us the sacrificial system, gave us the Old Testament priesthood. And all of this lays the foundation for the New Testament era. It all is the bedrock for the New Testament, really. This was a conditional covenant. The Mosaic covenant was a conditional covenant. It is between Yahweh and the children of Israel, and as a conditional covenant, it includes both blessings and curses. Blessing was contingent upon obedience to the law. Disobedience would result in judgment and even being removed from the land, dispersed with all the other nations. We see this in Deuteronomy 28 and 29. And this happened later in Israel's history. This actually happened to them. We know this. Israel was put out of the promised land, dispersed among the nations, and Judah was sent to Babylon. That's the story of the book of Daniel. The New Testament books like Romans, Galatians, Hebrews have a lot to say about the Mosaic covenant. Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, "For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law, the Mosaic law, comes the knowledge of sin." Paul also writes in Galatians chapter 3, verse 19, why then the law? It was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. The entire system of the law was abolished at Christ's death, and a new covenant was created. Romans chapter 10, verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And even though Christians don't live under the Mosaic law of God, the law is good. The law contains a lot about God and His character and our sinful condition, our inability to save ourselves. I want you to remember this. This is very important. The law is good. Think about this. Jesus loved the law. And if we're to be His disciples, we should love the Mosaic law as well. Try to read the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus, who loved it. He loved the law. Of course, it reveals, as I mentioned, the character of God. It's good and it's from God. And even if some of the law doesn't apply in the same way that it did for the Israelites, the law, at a minimum, demonstrates God's standard of righteousness. And so a study of the law is really quite essential to understanding Pauline doctrines of grace. If you find the books of Leviticus and Numbers difficult, just read carefully and study the book of Deuteronomy, for instance. And also read those books with the appreciation that Jesus loved these books. He loved Torah. And ultimately, the Lord wanted Israel to not only love the law, but also the lawgiver.